Throughout history, few names carry as much weight as that of Elisha, a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of Israel's most powerful prophets. His life stands as a reminder that God can take the most ordinary person and work through them to accomplish extraordinary things. Today we're exploring the incredible miracles performed by Prophet Elisha, one of the most prominent figures in the Bible. Dear listeners, welcome back to our channel, and prepare yourself for a narrative that will challenge your thinking and ignite your faith. As the successor to Elijah, Elisha carried on his mentor's legacy with powerful acts of faith that revealed God's mighty hand. In this video, we'll dive into 3 of Elisha's most remarkable miracles. These miracles not only demonstrated Elisha's prophetic power, but also the boundless compassion of God. Thanks for being here, and if you find this content helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to support our channel. Now, let's begin. Healing of Naaman's leprosy. The healing of Naaman's leprosy is one of the most profound miracles performed by the prophet Elisha, showcasing his role as a powerful servant of God. In the story of Naaman, we see how Elisha's simple yet divine instructions brought healing to a foreign military commander, highlighting the themes of faith, obedience, and God's mercy. Naaman was a highly respected and valiant commander in the Syrian-Aramean army. He had won numerous battles, and his reputation as a great warrior preceded him. However, despite his military success, Naaman had leprosy, a debilitating and incurable skin disease at the time, which not only caused physical pain but also brought social isolation and shame. Naaman's wife had a young Israelite servant girl who had been captured in a raid. The girl, showing kindness despite her captivity, mentioned that there was a prophet in Israel who could heal Naaman. She spoke of Elisha, the man of God, known for performing great miracles. Moved by the possibility of being cured, Naaman sought permission from the king of Aram to travel to Israel and seek healing. The king agreed and sent Naaman with a letter to the king of Israel, along with lavish gifts: 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of fine clothes. When Naaman arrived in Israel and presented the letter to the king was distressed, thinking it was a trap to start a conflict. He exclaimed, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life?" The king knew that curing leprosy was impossible for any man. However, when Elisha heard of Naaman's request, he sent word to the king, saying, "Let him come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman traveled to Elisha's house, expecting to meet the prophet personally. He anticipated a grand ritual or a dramatic healing process. Elisha didn't come out to greet him. Instead, he sent his servant to give Naaman a simple instruction: "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." This instruction angered Naaman. He had traveled a great distance with wealth and expectations, yet the prophet didn't even come out to meet him. He thought Elisha would at least wave his hand over him or perform some remarkable ritual. Moreover, Naaman considered the rivers in Damascus, Abana and Pharpar, superior to the waters of the Jordan. In his pride, he felt insulted and decided to leave, furious at the seemingly trivial command. As Naaman turned away in rage, his servants approached him with reason. They said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" Their words struck a chord with Naaman, and he realized he had nothing to lose by obeying the prophet's simple instructions. Naaman went to the Jordan River and, in humility, dipped himself 7 times as Elisha had instructed. On the 7th dip, a miraculous transformation occurred. His skin was restored to that of a young boy, completely free from leprosy. Not only was Naaman physically healed, but his heart was also changed. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Naaman returned to Elisha's home, declaring, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." He offered Elisha the gifts he had brought, but the prophet refused, making it clear that the healing was from God, not something to be bought. Naaman then asked for 2 mule loads of soil to take back with him to Syria, symbolizing his desire to worship the God of Israel alone. Naaman also made a unique request. As the commander of the Syrian army, he would sometimes have to enter the temple of Rimmon, the Syrian god, with his king. He asked for Elisha's pardon in advance, knowing his heart would only be worshipping the true God, even in that pagan temple. Elisha blessed him and sent him on his way in peace. This story emphasizes that true healing comes through faith and obedience, often in ways that defy human expectations. Naaman's journey from pride and anger to humility and faith mirrors the spiritual transformation that accompanies physical healing. It also reflects God's willingness to heal and show mercy to all who seek Him, regardless of their background or nationality. Multiplication of the widow's oil. The multiplication of the widow's oil is a touching story of God's provision for a widow in desperate need, illustrating how faith in God can bring miraculous solutions to seemingly impossible situations. Here's a detailed account of the miracle performed by the prophet Elisha, as recorded in 2 Kings 4, 1-7. The story begins with a widow from among the sons of the prophets, a group of men who were devoted to serving and learning from prophets like Elisha. Her husband had died, leaving her in a desperate financial situation. As she explains to Elisha, her late husband had incurred a debt that she could not repay, and the creditor was now threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves to settle the debt. This was not just a financial crisis, but a devastating situation that threatened to tear her family apart. In ancient Israel, it was not uncommon for people to sell themselves or their children into servitude if they were unable to pay debts, so the widow's fear was very real. She was completely out of options, and in her distress, she turned to Elisha for help, knowing that as a prophet he could intervene on her behalf. When the widow cried out to Elisha, he immediately showed concern and compassion. His first response was to ask her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" This question was crucial because Elisha wanted to know what resources she already had, no matter how small they seemed. The widow answered, "Your servant has nothing there at all except a small jar of olive oil." Her statement reflected her dire situation. She had virtually nothing of value left except for a small jar of oil. In the ancient world, oil was a valuable commodity used for cooking, lighting lamps, and as a base for perfumes and medicine, but a small jar wouldn't have been enough to resolve her overwhelming debt. Instead of providing her with money or food directly, Elisha gave her a curious instruction. He told her to go to all her neighbors and ask for as many empty jars as she could borrow. "Don't ask for just a few," he emphasized, indicating that she needed to gather a large number of jars. Then she was to return home with her sons, close the door, and begin pouring oil from her small jar into the empty ones. The instructions must have seemed puzzling to the widow. How could a small amount of oil fill multiple jars? But Elisha was teaching her an important lesson about faith. She had to trust that God would provide even when the solution seemed impossible. Without questioning the prophet, she obeyed. The widow and her sons went out and collected as many jars as they could find. Once they had gathered all the jars, they returned to the house, closed the door as instructed, and began the act of faith. She took her small jar of oil and started pouring it into the first empty jar. A miracle occurred. The oil kept flowing. It didn't run out, as she might have expected. Jar after jar, the oil continued to pour until the first was filled, then the next, and so on. Every jar they had borrowed was filled with oil, and still, the original small jar of oil had not run dry. The oil only stopped flowing when there were no more jars left to fill. This moment was a powerful demonstration of God's provision. The abundance of oil showed that God not only met the widow's immediate needs, but went above and beyond, providing more than enough to sustain her. Once all the jars were full, the widow returned to Elisha to report the miracle. He then instructed her, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." By selling the oil, she was able to pay off her late husband's debts and free her sons from the threat of slavery. But the miracle didn't just cover her debts, it provided enough for her and her sons to live on afterward. The abundance of oil signified God's generosity and care for her future, not just the resolution of her immediate problem. This story teaches key lessons about God's provision through faith, the importance of community, and His abundant blessings. By following Elisha's guidance and acting in faith, the widow experienced God's provision, not only enough to pay off her debts, but also to secure her family's future. Elisha's role as a prophet further emphasizes that God cares deeply for the vulnerable, offering hope and help to those in need. Raising of the Shunamite woman's son. The raising of the Shunamite woman's son is a remarkable and emotional miracle in the life of the prophet Elisha. The story, as recorded in 2 Kings 4, verses 8 to 37, reveals both the deep faith of the Shunamite woman and the power of God working through Elisha. The story begins in the town of Shunem, where a wealthy woman noticed that Elisha, the prophet, often passed through on his journeys. Out of respect and kindness, she offered him meals whenever he visited. Seeing Elisha's regular visits, the woman spoke to her husband and suggested they build a small upper room for Elisha to stay in whenever he came by. They furnished the room with simple necessities: a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. This act of hospitality showed the woman's generosity and her recognition of Elisha as a man of God. Elisha appreciated this kindness and wanted to bless her in return. Elisha wanted to express his gratitude to the Shunamite woman, so he asked his servant Gehazi what could be done for her. Gehazi pointed out that the woman was childless and her husband was old, meaning the possibility of having a child seemed remote. Elisha then called the woman and, speaking prophetically, told her, "About this time next year you will hold a son in your arms." The woman was astonished and initially hesitant to believe it, saying, "No, my lord, please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." She had likely given up hope of ever having a child. However, as Elisha had said, the following year she gave birth to a son, just as the prophet had promised. Years passed and the child grew. One day, while he was out in the fields with his father, the boy suddenly cried out, "My head! My head!" His father instructed a servant to carry him to his mother, thinking it was perhaps a minor illness. Despite his mother's care, the boy's condition worsened, and tragically, he died in her arms. The Shunamite woman was devastated, but she did something remarkable in her grief. She laid the child on Elisha's bed in the room they had prepared for him, and then she closed the door. Without telling anyone of her son's death, the Shunamite woman asked her husband to send a servant and a donkey so she could quickly go to see Elisha at Mount Carmel. Her husband, unaware of the tragedy, asked why she was going, since it wasn't a Sabbath or festival day when one would normally seek out a prophet. She replied simply, "It is well," showing her determination and faith that Elisha could help. When she reached Mount Carmel, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, went out to meet her. But she didn't stop for Gehazi, she was focused on reaching Elisha. Falling at Elisha's feet, she poured out her sorrow, expressing the depth of her anguish. She reminded Elisha that she had never asked for a son, and had even been hesitant to believe the promise. Now her promised child was gone, and she sought Elisha's intervention. Seeing her deep distress, Elisha immediately sent Gehazi ahead with his staff to lay on the boy's face, but he himself followed behind with the woman. Gehazi obeyed, but when he reached the child and placed the staff on him, the boy did not wake. Gehazi returned to Elisha with the news that there had been no change. Elisha then arrived at the house, where he found the lifeless child lying on his bed. What followed was an extraordinary act of faith and prayer. Elisha entered the room, shut the door, and prayed to the Lord. Then he did something unusual. He stretched himself out over the boy, placing his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on the boy's eyes, and his hands on the boy's hands. As Elisha did this, the child's body began to grow warm, but he was still not fully revived. Elisha got up, walked around the room, and then stretched himself out on the boy once again. This time, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The miracle had occurred. The child had been brought back to life by the power of God. Overjoyed, Elisha called Gehazi and told him to summon the Shunamite woman. When she entered the room, Elisha said, "Take your son." She fell at Elisha's feet in gratitude and awe before picking up her son, now fully alive, and leaving the room. This miracle was not only a demonstration of God's power over life and death, but also a testament to the deep faith of the Shunamite woman. Despite the overwhelming sorrow of losing her son, she did not give up hope. She believed that Elisha, as a prophet of God, could help, and her faith was rewarded. In this story, we see a profound interaction between faith, prayer, and divine intervention. The Shunamite woman's story encourages believers to trust God's power and timing, even when circumstances seem impossible. Elisha served as the vessel through which the miraculous resurrection took place, reinforcing the deep connection between faith, prophetic authority, and God's miraculous workings. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intriguing content. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.